It was a cold, gray morning and the sky hung heavy with dark clouds. The soft patter of rain on the pavement added to the somber silence. Underneath the bridge at the edge of the small town, something unusual was happening. "Do you hear that?" Sarah whispered to her younger brother, Tim, as they walked home from school. Her green scarf was wrapped tightly around her neck, shielding her from the biting chill. Tim, clutching his old red backpack, paused and tilted his head. The sound was faint, almost drowned out by the steady hum of passing cars above them. A soft, high-pitched whimpering. "It's coming from under the bridge," Tim said, his voice trembling slightly. The siblings exchanged a glance. They had passed by the spot countless times before, but today felt different. The crying sound wasn't just a noise, it was a plea. "Maybe it's just the wind," Sarah suggested, though her heart told her otherwise. But as they took a few cautious steps closer, the sound grew louder. It was unmistakable now. Someone or something was in pain. Under the bridge, the space was dimly lit, with piles of fallen leaves and discarded trash scattered across the muddy ground. The smell of damp earth and rusted metal hung in the air. Despite the eerie atmosphere, Sarah and Tim couldn't turn away. "I think it's a dog," Tim murmured, his eyes wide with concern. Sarah hesitated. They weren't supposed to wander under the bridge. It was one of Mom's strict rules. But how could they ignore this? "Let's check," she finally said, her voice firm despite the lump forming in her throat. As they carefully approached the source of the sound, their shoes sinking slightly into the mud, Sarah couldn't shake a strange feeling. This wasn't just about finding a crying dog. Somehow, she knew this moment was going to change everything. As Sarah and Tim edged closer to the source of the whimpering, their breaths caught in their throats. Beneath a pile of tangled branches and old newspapers, a small, mud-covered dog lay trembling. Its matted fur clung to its tiny body, and its ribs were painfully visible. One of its hind legs was bent at an unnatural angle, and every breath it took seemed to come with a shudder of pain. "Oh no," Tim gasped, dropping to his knees. "Sarah, it's hurt." The dog flinched at their approach, its dark eyes wide with fear. It let out a feeble growl, more of a desperate plea than a threat. Tim reached out cautiously, his hand trembling. "It's okay, buddy," he murmured. "We won't hurt you." Sarah's heart ached as she knelt beside her brother. The sight of the dog's broken body was almost too much to bear. "How could someone leave it like this?" she whispered, her voice cracking. Tim glanced up at her, his eyes welling with tears. "We can't just leave it here. It'll die." Sarah's mind raced. The bridge was cold and damp, and the rain was starting to come down harder. The dog wouldn't survive much longer in this condition. But what could they do? They didn't have a phone, and their mom was still at work. "We have to get it help," Sarah said firmly. "We can't wait." Tim hesitated. "What if it bites us?" "It's scared." Sarah looked at the dog's trembling body and felt a surge of determination. "It's scared because it's in pain." "We'd be scared too." Carefully, she slipped off her green scarf and handed it to Tim. "Here, let's use this to pick it up. We'll take it to Mr. Thompson's house. He has a car and he'll know what to do." Tim nodded, his hands shaking as they wrapped the scarf gently around the dog. It let out a soft whimper but didn't resist. As they lifted the fragile creature together, Sarah felt a strange connection, an unspoken promise. This wasn't just about saving the dog's life. Somehow, it felt like they were about to find something bigger than themselves. Something they didn't yet understand. With the dog cradled between them, they started the long, muddy trek to Mr. Thompson's house, hoping they weren't too late. The rain was relentless now, soaking Sarah and Tim as they trudged through the muddy path toward Mr. Thompson's house. The scarf that cradled the small dog was damp and heavy, but they couldn't stop. "Hold on, little guy," Tim whispered, glancing down at the trembling animal in his arms. Its shallow breaths were uneven, but it had stopped growling. The dog's dark eyes flickered open for a moment, meeting Tim's gaze. It was a fleeting moment, but something about the way the dog looked at him made Tim's chest tighten. "Sarah, what if it doesn't make it?" Tim asked, his voice barely audible over the rain. "It will," Sarah said, her tone more confident than she felt. She refused to let fear take over. We just have to keep going. As they reached the gravel road leading to Mr. Thompson's house, their path was blocked by a large puddle of water. The rain had turned the road into a shallow stream, and the current was stronger than it looked. We'll have to go around, Sarah said, glancing toward the woods on their right. Tim hesitated. The woods were dense, dark, and unfamiliar, but they didn't have a choice. Okay, he said, adjusting his grip on the dog. The siblings stepped carefully into the woods, the rain dripping from the leaves above them. The ground was uneven, and every step felt like a struggle. Sarah slipped once, her knee hitting the mud hard, but she quickly pushed herself up. I'm fine, she assured Tim, though her palms stung from the fall. Tim noticed the dog twitch slightly, letting out a faint whine. Hang in there, buddy, he said softly. As they navigated through the woods, they began to talk to the dog, almost instinctively. You're a fighter, aren't you? Sarah said, her voice gentle. I bet you've been through so much. But you're not alone anymore. We've got you. Tim nodded, his grip tightening. Yeah, we won't let anything bad happen to you again. You're safe now. The dog's eyes fluttered open again, and for the first time, its tail gave the faintest wag. It was weak, but it was there. Did you see that? Tim whispered, his face lighting up despite the rain. Sarah smiled through her exhaustion. Yeah, I saw it. He trusts us. The moment of hope was short-lived. A loud crack of thunder echoed through the woods, and the dog flinched violently in Tim's arms. Startled, Tim stumbled over a tree root and nearly fell. Sarah caught him just in time, steadying both her brother and the dog. We're almost there, she said, though she wasn't sure if she was reassuring Tim, the dog, or herself. Finally, the faint outline of Mr. Thompson's house appeared through the trees. The old man lived on the outskirts of town and was known for being a retired vet. He had a kind heart and a soft spot for animals. They reached his front porch, breathless and drenched. Sarah knocked frantically on the door, her hand trembling. The door opened to reveal Mr. Thompson, a tall man with graying hair and warm eyes. He took one look at the scene in front of him, the muddy, shivering kids, and the injured dog, and immediately stepped aside. Come in, he said, ushering them inside the cozy warmth of his home. Tim carefully set the dog down on a blanket Mr. Thompson spread out on the floor. The old man crouched beside it, his experienced hands gently examining the animal. He's in bad shape, Mr. Thompson said after a moment. But you did the right thing bringing him here. You might have just saved his life. Sarah and Tim exchanged a look, relief washing over them. Will he be okay? Tim asked. Mr. Thompson smiled. With some care and a bit of luck, I think he'll pull through. You two did a brave thing today. As Mr. Thompson worked to clean the dog's wounds and splint its broken leg, Sarah and Tim stayed by its side, whispering words of encouragement. The dog seemed to sense their presence, its body relaxing slightly as it drifted into a more peaceful sleep. For the first time that day, Sarah allowed herself to breathe. They weren't out of the woods yet, but for now, the tiny creature had a fighting chance, and so did their hope. The hours dragged on as Mr. Thompson worked tirelessly to stabilize the dog. Sarah and Tim sat on the floor near the fireplace, watching with bated breath as the old man moved between his tools and the fragile animal lying on the blanket. Every so often, the dog would whimper softly, and Sarah's heart would ache all over again. Is he going to make it? Tim finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Thompson paused, wiping his hands on a towel. He's a fighter, he said, glancing at the dog. But it's going to take everything he's got, and maybe a little extra from us. The weight of those words hung in the room. The fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows across the walls. Tim leaned closer to the dog, gently stroking its head. Come on, buddy, he murmured. You can do this. We believe in you. Hours turned into the quiet stillness of the night. Sarah and Tim refused to leave, their exhaustion forgotten in the face of the tiny life fighting to hold on. The rain had stopped, but the occasional rumble of thunder in the distance served as a reminder of the storm they had braved together. Then, Just as the first light of dawn crept through the windows, something miraculous happened. The dog stirred, its body shifting slightly on the blanket. Its eyes fluttered open, and for the first time, they were no longer clouded with fear or pain. Instead, there was a flicker of recognition, a spark of life. "He's waking up," Sarah gasped, grabbing Tim's arm. The siblings watched in awe as the dog slowly lifted its head, its nose twitching as it took in its surroundings. It let out a soft, tentative whine, and Tim couldn't hold back his tears any longer. "You did it," he whispered, his voice breaking. "You're going to be okay." The dog's gaze shifted between Sarah and Tim, and then, as if it understood the love and effort they had poured into saving it, it did something that caught everyone off guard. It weakly stretched out its paw and placed it on Tim's hand. Tim froze, tears streaming down his face. "Did you see that, Sarah?" Sarah nodded, her own eyes glistening. "He's thanking us." Mr. Thompson chuckled softly, though his voice was thick with emotion. Dogs have a way of knowing who their heroes are. For a moment, the room was filled with an overwhelming sense of peace and connection. The fire crackled warmly, the dog's tail gave the faintest wag, and Sarah and Tim felt something they hadn't expected: hope. In that moment, the bridge they had crossed wasn't just a physical one, it was a bridge between despair and compassion, between fear and love. The bond they had formed with the dog was unbreakable, and they knew their lives would never be the same. In the days that followed, the dog's recovery became the heart of Sarah and Tim's lives. They visited Mr. Thompson's house every day after school, bringing scraps of food and old towels to help keep the little dog warm and comfortable. The dog, whom they had decided to name Lucky, seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. His once dull, matted coat began to shine as Sarah gently brushed it out. His leg, now in a proper splint, was healing well under Mr. Thompson's watchful care. And though Lucky still had moments of hesitation, his tail wagged more often now, especially when Sarah and Tim walked through the door. "You know," Mr. Thompson said one afternoon as they sat in his cozy kitchen, sipping cocoa, "what you two did was remarkable. Most people would have walked away, thinking it wasn't their problem. But you didn't. You showed compassion and courage." Tim, cradling Lucky in his lap, looked up. "We couldn't just leave him there. It wouldn't have been right." Sarah nodded. "He needed us, but I think we needed him too." Mr. Thompson smiled. "That's the thing about kindness, it doesn't just change the life of the one receiving it. It changes the giver too." That night, as Sarah and Tim walked home, they talked about everything they had learned. "I used to think helping someone meant you had to be older or stronger," Tim said, kicking a pebble along the path. "But now I know it's not about that. It's about caring enough to do something, even if it's hard." Sarah smiled at her brother, feeling a surge of pride. "You're right. Lucky reminded us that even the smallest actions can make a big difference." As they reached their house, the sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, the storm long gone. Lucky was staying with Mr. Thompson for a little while longer, but he already felt like part of their family. For Sarah and Tim, life would go on, but they knew they were different now, stronger, kinder, and more connected to the world around them. A few weeks later, Lucky was a completely different dog. His leg had healed, his coat was glossy and clean, and the spark in his eyes was unmistakable. When Sarah and Tim arrived at Mr. Thompson's house to bring him home for good, Lucky barked joyfully and bounded toward them, his tail wagging so hard it looked like it might fly off. "Looks like someone's ready to go," Mr. Thompson said with a warm smile, handing Sarah a leash. As they walked home, Lucky trotted proudly beside them, his eyes scanning his surroundings with excitement. Passers-by stopped to admire the happy dog, and Sarah and Tim proudly told them Lucky's story. Once they reached their front yard, Lucky sat down for a moment, looking up at Sarah and Tim as if to say, "Thank you." It was a look of pure love and gratitude, one that neither of them would ever forget. That night, as Lucky lay curled up at the foot of Sarah's bed, she whispered softly to him, "You saved us too, you know. You reminded us how important it is to care, to act, and to never give up." Tim chimed in from his spot by the door. "Yeah, Lucky. You're more than just a dog. You're a hero. The house felt warmer than it ever had, filled with love, hope, and the reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness can make a difference. Kindness can change the world, one small step at a time. Lucky's story isn't just about a dog being saved. It's about the courage to care and the power of love to heal, no matter how broken something might seem. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs a little inspiration today. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories that remind us of the good in the world. Let's spread the message. Kindness matters.